So when we see here in the book of Daniel, we're looking at when Judah had been taken into captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. And one thing that the Babylonians had begun working on was assimilating the Jews to the Babylonian culture. And even going as far as changing the names, the Hebrew names of the Jews, and assigning them Babylonian names. And tonight I want to look at three of Jewish young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That is their Babylonian name. And I believe that their Hebrew names was Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah. And if you want to study something a little bit interesting, look up what the meaning of those names are. We don't have time for that tonight. So let's go ahead and get started. Here in Daniel chapter 3, let's read the first 6 verses. It says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 80 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors, and the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then an herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of the fiery furnace. So we see here that the people now are forced into worshiping a false god, an idol that they are ordered to bow down to and to worship, or they're going to die. But question I want to ask you, what idol in your life is demanding that you worship? What idols are challenging your faith? You know, well, today the government is beginning to demand that you bow down and worship it. You know, the mandates are placed on us is one of the examples. That is the government saying you will bow down and follow our commands. And you know, when you look at it, they are basically telling the American people that resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. That's for our Trekkies in here tonight. They'll know what that means. But isn't that what Nebuchadnezzar was telling the people? Resistance is futile. You're going to be assimilated. You're going to do what I tell you to do, or we're going to take your life. But let me ask you this. What about the sin in your life that demands you to bow down to it? The flesh saying, I want to be the idol that you worship. And you know, those are the things that challenge our faith. You know, the one thing that keeps, that sin that keeps raising its ugly head and tells you to just indulge yourself. When your faith is challenged, it is an opportunity for us to allow God to work and show himself in a mighty way in and through our life. You see, every time that our faith is challenged, whether it's from something like the government or whether it's from the flesh in our life, or when we go through things in our life like the loss of a loved one, or loss of friends, or what we've been through in COVID, I can tell you, my faith has been challenged over the last 1.5 to 2 years. with everything that has been going on. And, you know, it's not going to stop until the Lord returns. We're going to be challenged as long as we as believers are on this earth. Our faith is going to be challenged. So look here in verses 6 and 7. It says, "And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall be the same hour be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore at that time when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and all the kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up." I want to tell you right now, usually the majority is going in the opposite direction of God. You know, and even Christians today are following the majority because they're not willing to take a stand. And let's be honest tonight, when our faith is challenged, I want you to know it's going to cost us something. It always will. You know, when we stop resisting, when we don't stand up for our faith, I can tell you 3 things right now it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you your peace. It's going to cost you your joy. And you're going to damage your relationship with Jesus Christ. But when we resist and remain steadfast in our faith, you know what it could cost you? It could cost you your job. It can cost you your friends. It may even cost you your life. So either way, we're going to pay a price one way or another. It's going to cost us. So let's look here at verse 8 through 13. He says, "Wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever." Don't you love how they come to him and then they just pump up his ego and his pride? "Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and the dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth, that he should be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And then there were certain Jews thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar in his rage and fury commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king." I want you to know that when you take a stand, there's people that's going to hate you for it. They're going to hate you for it. And they're going to want to destroy you because you refuse to bow down to the idols of this world. They hate it. The world today is in an all-out attack against the church, against believers. People that are taking biblical stands are being trashed, and people are trying to destroy their character. The world wants the church gone. And you know what? If they just be patient, it will be. It will be. And what a blessing on that day when we're called home to be with our Lord and Savior forever and ever and ever. See, the world wants Christianity to be declared as a mental disease. Do you know that? They're working on that right now to get Christianity declared a mental disease. And another thing, any Bible-believing Christian, they want them and marked down as domestic terrorists. That's in the works right now. See, these are the things that's challenging our faith when we're confronted with these things. See, this is what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were facing. They were facing a major challenge to their faith in this story. Let's look at verses 14 and 15. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now if ye be ready, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Who is that God? Who is that God? You know, he's going to find out who that God is. You see, these three young men were in for a challenge. And you know what? They handled it. Their faith was being challenged, and if they did not comply, it would or could cost them their lives. But you know what? God had a plan. And when your faith is challenged, always understand God has a plan. Even though we may not see what it is, God's working. He is working. How many of you right now, your faith has been challenged over the last 2 years? And for those that didn't raise your hand, be patient. It's coming. It is coming. But you know something that was interesting in this? That Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had such a great reputation, the king gave them a second chance, and that was unheard of. Because they were already taking a stand and following God, and because of their reputation, the king gave them that second chance. And look at here at verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. Now the heat's getting turned up. They are brought before the king. And you know what they're saying here when they say we're not careful in our answer to you as the king? They're saying, they are telling him that his position as king isn't going to influence their answer to his demand. That's what they're saying. That tells you right there where their heart is. That tells you right there the faith that they have when they say, you know what, King, we can respect your position, but you're asking us to do something against our God, and we don't care what your position is. We will tell you we're not going to fall down in worship. We're not going to fall down in worship. You see, this is how we need to respond in our day. Stop worrying about man and obey God. So often we're concerned about what man can do to us instead of worrying about what God can do. See, we worry more about how the world and how man can do damage to us than looking at our God who can protect us from man. And a lot of times this is where we get into trouble. But see, that's a sign of where our faith is. You see, Acts 5:29 says, Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, We ought to obey God rather than man. And we're going to be put to test. But what I love is these three Hebrew children, they're not done yet. You got to remember, these were young men. I've heard everything from teenage years to maybe the early 20s. These young men were already grounded in their relationship with God at a very, very early age. But look at verses 17 and 18. They say, If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fire and furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. Verse 18, but if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. You know, they're basically telling the king, you know what, you may think that you are in control, but you're not. You're not. They were telling them their God was the one that was in control. And boy, we need to remember that. We need to remember that. In these trying times that we're going through today, we have to remember that God is in control and nothing touches us that He does not allow as His children. Nothing. These three men were winners no matter the outcome because they remained steadfast in their faith. Think about this. If God delivered them from the furnace, they were winners. If God took their life in the fiery furnace, they're still winners. That's what they were talking about when they basically telling the king, you're not the one that's in control. Our God is the one that's in control. And no matter what happens to us, we win because God is in control. And His decisions is always the right decisions. And you say, well, how could they win if they get burned up in the furnace? They're in the presence of the Lord. That is something that we're looking forward to. And if He delivers them, they're still winners. Either way. So the questions I have for you tonight is, how were these three able to take such a stand like this when their life was on the line? And here's the root of the message. Number one, they had the right focus because of their faith. Their strong faith. They had the right focus. Look at here at verse 17. If it be so, our God whom we serve. Look at this. You had a group of people that realized that they're not bowing down, so they run and tattletale on them. The king says, bring them before me. So, he brings them. They're in front of the king. He said, look, if you don't do it, you're going in the furnace and you're going to die. Let me ask you something. If you put in a position like that, what's going to be the thoughts going through your mind? You know who was the center of their thoughts? God. In the heat of the challenge of their faith, their thought was on God. How often that when our waters get churned up, our faith gets challenged to where it comes nowhere close to us losing our life, but our thoughts are somewhere else besides on God. Instead of being focused on Him. But see, the reason why these three young men could do that is because they had a close relationship with God. They loved God and served Him. And they understood God's commandments. They understood Exodus 20, verses 3 and 4. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. They understood that. They understood that that was a commandment of God. So there was no way, even with the threat of death. And I'm going to tell you right now, I can't think of a worse way to go than being burned to death. And they stood up and said, hey, our God says we're not to worship any other. And we're not going to. God was the center of their thoughts in the heat of the challenge. In the heat of the challenge. And you know, for us to answer the challenge, we must have the faith that would keep us focused on Christ. Isaiah 26:3 says, Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee, because he trusteth thee. I tell you, I love Psalms 112:7. He shall not be afraid of evil tidings. His heart is fixed, trusting in the Lord. They trusted God in a very, very pressure cooker situation. God was on their mind. Not what was going on, not whether or not they was going to live or die. They weren't concerned about that. They was only concerned about staying faithful and trusting God. And that's it. See in 2 Corinthians 5:7, for we walk by faith, not by sight. You know what? I believe they seen that furnace when they went before the king. I hate to say it, if I would have seen that, I think I'd be thinking more about the fire than thinking more about God. I'm just being honest with you. But these young men, they walked by faith. They lived their life by faith. They trusted God. And their faith is challenged here with their own life. And what did they say? Our God whom we serve. Our God whom we serve. See, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego loved God and obeyed His commandments. That is where their strength came from. It was because of that love and trust and faith that they had in God. God gave them the strength to stand up when they were challenged. You can't do it on your own. You can't. It's impossible. You need that close personal relationship with Christ. You see, when we love God, our faith will grow and our focus becomes more fixed upon Christ. And you know how you grow in your love for Christ? Getting in His Word and getting to know Him more. My love for my wife is greater now than what it was when we first got married. Why? Because we know each other better than we did when we first got married. You see, and when we get to know the Lord and get to know how much that He loves us, we'll want to obey His commandments. And He will build our faith and trust in Him through that love for Him. That's what He'll do. John 14:15 says, if you love me, keep my commandments. See, these three young men showed their love for God because they kept His commandments. They remained faithful. They remained strong in the heat of the challenge. These three young men had a boldness that could only come from a close walk with God. Number two, they believed in the faithfulness of God. The faithfulness of God. Look at verse 17. And if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of thine hand, O King. They knew God was going to be faithful in this situation. He will, not He might, not He could. He will deliver us. How many of you pray? Every hand should go up in here. Now, when you pray, are you praying with the heart attitude that God will answer or God can answer? There's a huge difference between the two. Huge difference between God can and believing that. And I think most are going to say, I believe God can do that. But do you believe He will do that? These three young men here are faced with death, staring them in the face. And they say, God will deliver us from thy hand, O king. That he will deliver us. They had no doubt in their mind that God was working and God had the situation under control. That should bring us all a little bit of comfort in knowing that. That when we're facing that fiery furnace, don't worry about the furnace. God's got it. God's got it. See, they knew God was faithful and they trusted in his faithfulness. Has God ever let you down? You know, in our own mind sometimes we think that he has. But you know what? That's because we're looking at it through fleshly eyes and not looking through it with spiritual eyes in the light of who God is and knowing that he is working. Because he is. Number 3, their resistance was not futile. Their resistance was not futile. Let's look at verses 18 through 27. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. See, he had a little bit of respect for them until this second time that they refused to follow his orders. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. Now I'll tell you, that's what the world wants to do to us. They want to turn the heat up a lot hotter on believers. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in the army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosens, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, in the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Could you imagine what the people were thinking that was watching this? And the men that had them took them up there? You know, you got to think, wait a minute, and it burned them up. What happened to them? What happened to the other 3? Why didn't they get burned up before they even got tossed in? Verse 23, and these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was stoned, and rose up into haste, and spake and said unto his counselors, did not we cast 3 men bound in the midst of fire? They answered and said unto the king, true, O king. He answered and said, lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. God's in control. He knows exactly what he is doing. And it says, the Nebuchadnezzar again came near the mouth of the burning furnace, here in 26 again, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, go, ye servants of the Most High God. Come forth, come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth out of the midst of the fire. And the princes, governors, and captains, and kings' counselors, being gathered together, saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their heads singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of the fire had passed on them. You know what's amazing about that? You could have a fire going 6 blocks away, and you go outside and you come back in the house, you're like, man, you got the smell of that fire on you. They come out of the furnace. Can't even smell anything on them. It's like they never got anywhere near the furnace. You see, they placed everything in the hands of God, including their life. And they remained steadfast, and their faith did not waver, and God delivered them. I would love to have seen their reaction when Jesus Christ showed up in the furnace with them. They didn't know it when they were being tossed in. But you know what? They knew, they had to know something was up, because they didn't even feel the heat of the fire as they were being tossed in. You want to know why? Because their focus was so much on God and who He is and His faithfulness that they wasn't worried. I don't think they were afraid, to be perfectly honest with you. I think they had so much of the peace of God in their life that when they went into that furnace, it didn't matter to them. Because they knew their God was faithful and He was in control. And that's where we need to be when we're challenged today. When the government comes along and says, you're going to do this, or we're going to take your livelihood away, or we're going to make it to where you can't get groceries. And listen, the day's coming. The day is coming. So we need to respond in the same way as these three young men did, but the only way that's going to happen is to get into His Word and get to know Him, and through growing in your love for Him, and then your faith is going to grow, your trust in Him is going to grow, and then when those heavy challenges come, which they will, we'll be able to say, you know what, toss me in the furnace. My God's in control. He knows what He's doing. You have no control over me. You can't touch me unless God allows it. And this is where these guys were. This is where they were. No flame touched them. They had no smell of smoke on them, and their garments were whole. Listen, they didn't wear clothes that were fire retardant back then. That stuff probably went up just like that if you ever put a match to it. But because of their faith, you know what? God winds up receiving the honor and the glory. And number 4, remaining steadfast in the midst of the challenge to our faith will have an effect on others around us. Look how Nebuchadnezzar was affected. Look in verse 15. At the end of that verse, he says, and who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? He's saying, your God, you think they're going to take you out of my control? Out of my hand? Who is that God? Then look in verse 26. After what he's seen, what that God could do, look at how it changed his attitude. Verse 26, he says, go ye servants of the Most High God. Tell me, that ain't beginning to have an effect on others that was there. Look, we don't know what kind of effect it had on the audience, but I can guarantee you one thing. It had an effect on those that were watching. And then verse 28. He says, then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who have sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him. What a testimony that they had to the king in defiance to the king's orders. Their testimony had a positive effect on Nebuchadnezzar. Then look at verse 29, the last part of that verse. It says, there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. What changed Nebuchadnezzar's mind? God. And you know, and when I seen that and I read that, a verse came to my mind that was Proverbs 21:1. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of the water, he turneth it whithersoever he will. All this whole time, Nebuchadnezzar thought he was top dog. He thought that his word was the last word. But God opened his eyes. Did he serve and stay faithful to God? No. But you know what? He changed his mind in this situation. See, this world is beginning to take joy in challenging a believer's faith because too many are not up to the challenge like these three young men were. Just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we can withstand the challenge and come out on the other side victorious if we would just follow their lead. And that is, number one, we got to have that right focus. When that heat and that challenge comes, we got to have our focus on God. We got to have faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please Him. We got to have faith. And then we got to trust in the faithfulness of God. You know one thing that I love about the Psalms? Number one, it's a book about depression. David was depressed. David struggled. And then you know what he did when he'd go and he'd bear his heart and his soul out to God with everything that he was dealing with? He would remember the faithfulness of God in his life before these struggles came along. God's faithful. No matter what challenge we're going through, no matter what is trying to break our faith in God, He is always faithful. He'll never leave you nor forsake you. Never. That's a promise. But oh, how often we leave Him when the fiery furnace comes into our sights. But we don't need to. We don't have to. We have the power of the Holy Spirit living within us that can sit there and give us whatever we need to make it through. But we have to trust in Him. We have to keep our focus on Him. And we got to trust in that faithfulness of God. You know, when Peter walked on the water, you hear it over and over and over, but sometimes I don't think it sinks in. When did he begin to sink? When he lost his focus, when he took his focus off of God. To think about it, the man was walking on water. Why? Because he was trusting and keeping his eyes fixed on God. But how often, when we look at that storm, that challenge, that we get our eyes off of Him? And number 4, and I end with this, and know that your steadfastness will have a positive effect for the cause of Christ, and God will get all the honor and glory. Listen, we're going to have a lot of challenges to our faith. And we need to make up our mind now that we're going to get to the place that we need to be in our relationship with God, that we can respond to those challenges the way these 3 Hebrew children did. to get to that point of knowing that He is in control and He's going to take care of it no matter what. I can tell you this, the older and older I get, the more and more I'm looking forward to being in the presence of my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So if I'm challenged and it winds up costing me my life, so be it. I'm a whole lot better off. I don't know if I get this story right, but I think it was a pastor and his wife was walking on the street and some guy came up to him. And I think he pulled out a knife and told him, said, give me all your money or I'm going to kill you. And he says, you going to sit there and threaten me with heaven? That's what he was doing. The man had no fear for his own life. Why? Because he loved God and he trusted Him. I want to encourage you tonight. When that challenge comes, stay focused on Him. Trust Him. And remember His faithfulness in your life.